my name is Kavita. I'm an architect. Currently, I do a lot of social engagement and community engagement. So part of that is looking at EDI in the industry. Another part of that is working with children and young people in schools through the Reaper Architects Ambassador Scheme. And then I'm also an ambassador for an architectural charity. So with that, we look at pushing mental health, well-being, employment, and a whole range of things within under that realm for the architectural community.
Yeah, architecture is a really interesting one because people often group architecture under the umbrella of engineering.
Mm-hmm.
But it's also a very creative subject. So it's kind of like engineering with a very artistic twist.
Yeah, so ultimately it's the buildings that engineers do then go on to design, and we have to have an understanding of how structures come together, how structures work. But no, there is a whole realm of architecture that I think a lot of people take for granted. So there's the design, the art side. There's the law and the financial side. So especially when you're doing fees and fee appraisals, understanding how local authorities work, building regulations. So there's a safety aspect. So we look at Grenfell, and there was a lot of onus on the architect as well to ensure that they understood the engineering behind the building, whether that's to do with fire regulation, structure, fire stopping. And then there's just the human and the social side, so understanding people, the different way different people live, whether they have a disability, an accessibility issue, whether you're in a family, you're a single person, and just as well meeting your clients, meeting people on site. So there isn't one set role within the profession.
If the left side of your brain was in charge of more logical things and the right side of your brain is more in charge of creativity, which side of the brain are you using more or most in architecture?
I think it depends on what day it is and what stage of the project. So I'm currently working on a couple of schemes. So one's at design stage, so that would definitely be the design and the creative side. And I've just come back from site, and that's definitely the logistical side of that. So the problem solving, just actually being able to identify and filter information, and process that in a way you can reflect on the design side, but then you're also balancing up, actually we need a resolution, but how do we tie this up without impacting on our approved design and the scheme that's been signed off? So I think it varies on the project, the client, your brief, the type of project you work for or on, even the type of practice you work in.
Yeah, I mean, my sister's an architect, and just hearing you confirms that architects really are highly multi-talented people, because they really use all facets of themselves and apply a whole range of skills to make architecture happen.
100%, and I think multifaceted is the word that's often used, but I always say this to the students I work with: actually, you don't need to be good at it all. You can specialize in a certain niche, a certain segment of that umbrella. And if you like the on-site stuff more, as I do, you can specialize in that, as long as you have the understanding of the design and the creativity side, or on the flip side, you can look at more of the design and get into the nitty-gritty of that. And then focus a little bit less with the on-site experience. But I think for myself, I much prefer that whole rounded experience and seeing it from concept to fruition.
Yeah, it sounds like architecture it takes a village, just like it does in engineering or any other profession. Well, one of the burning questions I have, which sounds so superficial, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is why do architects not earn very much generally when they're so multi-talented?
So I think there's two prongs to the fork. So I think first and foremost, a certain type of contract was brought in probably about 20 years ago, and it put a lot of onus on the contractor. So the contractor will come in at a certain stage of the project and the design element and the risk ultimately will go to them. So that's devaluing us. So a large portion of our role, the design, no longer sits with us, and also the risk no longer sits with us. I think as well with new systems, so we have prefabricated systems, we have systems that are quicker, easier, faster to install. So there's less detailing, there's less design on us. If we look at some of the high-rise buildings, 100 years ago, we would have built that in brick and block or just a concrete frame. But now you can get prefabricated panels. So we're not doing the detailing and the junctions and the interfaces between those. So I think that they're the kind of the two key issues. And also, I think it's like every other profession, we have so many more students coming out of university now, which has also just devalued the profession generally. So if you have more people to pick from, there's not, you don't really have that bargaining chip. You're not the best of 10 anymore. You're probably the best of 1,000. So that negotiation as well is also quite difficult.
Yeah. And of those new graduates, what's the gender split like?
So there are three parts to the architecture course. There's part one, which is your undergrad, part two, your postgrad, and then part three is your postgraduate diploma. So you often find at part one, it's 50-50. I think a couple of years ago, we were at 60-40 to female. We're at quite high numbers. I think one, just because of the length of the course. So full-time, it's 7 years to complete. So we then start to see the rate and the number of females in the profession drop. And that's often because if you get married or you have children, that obviously puts your studies on hold. Also, being a female in the construction industry or the engineering industry or just a generally typically male-dominated industry is quite hard. So you'll often find that females move to maybe contractor side roles or maybe more design focused roles, and they feel that the role of the architect is not for them. And whilst it is improving, there are a number of conversations that we're still having within this industry and this profession, as we are having globally. So as a female architect, it's quite poor as a qualified practicing female, but it is promising that we're starting to see more commitment from females from different backgrounds as well. So maybe 10 years ago when I was studying, I was the only female Asian on my course. But now actually coming out of that, we're seeing more people from different ethnic backgrounds, different social class, and just generally showing different characteristics that identify them as diverse. So it's not the best, but it is improving since I started.
Yeah, I mean, I've seen a huge amount of change over the decades, and the change is in an extremely positive direction. What's your opinion on the importance of diversity in your profession? Like, how does it affect the profession as a whole?
So I think there's two elements to this. One, you just need good management. And two, you also need role models. So it's an industry that you learn. So I've had really great management. They've really pushed me into different opportunities within and out of the practice. And they've also enabled me to get involved with a whole host of extracurricular activities, which they contribute to the architectural community, but they don't contribute to my job. I think with the role models, it's been quite difficult for myself. I've never really had anyone that I could resonate with. I've not had anyone that looks like me or is similar to me, and it's always been hard when you're trying to almost break the barrier and break that stigma of, to be or to succeed in this profession, you have to be white, middle-aged, male and middle class. And I think not having someone in the level above you in that position, it's quite hard to actually break down those barriers and have the conversations. And I think my management here are great, but then there's also, unless you've been in that position, you just don't understand. So I think it's just so important in the sense of a role model to actually show what you can achieve and who you can be within the profession. I've found softer role models in terms of my technical learning and abilities, but I think I will always have a different experience to my male counterpart or my Caucasian counterpart. And I think it's just so important that across the industry we have that representation.
Yeah. Let's delve into that a little bit, because I'm looking at the same thing. It's an issue that's always been there. I mean, you know, as a mechanical engineer in engineering, I completely resonate with what you're saying. Like, there just was no one like me. And the reason why I want to dive into it is because it doesn't get said enough, and it doesn't get heard. Like, it may be said, but then people move on. And it's like, can we just stay there for a minute? Because it is such a major thing to be in an environment where there is no one like you. It's a major thing. You know, it comes with so many knock-on effects. Like, you know, I'd love to hear what your experiences have been, but like, for me, being in a community where there's no one like me has often left me feeling really odd.
Yeah, I think it's I wouldn't use the word isolating from my experience, but I can see for certain people. So I'm quite fortunate that whilst I'm from an Indian background, my mum has been liberal, but you know, had I been born into a different Indian family, you know, I may not have had, you know, culturally it's unacceptable to go out as an unmarried female, you know, to network, to go out and speak with certain types of people. And it can be quite isolating if there isn't that understanding, if those boundaries aren't put into place. You know, certain religious practices, there are a certain number of people that practice from various religions, and you know that defines their day, their pattern around the lunar cycle. And I think the problem, if we don't represent these people, we don't have conversations around it, they can't really be included. We're just asking them to conform into our work process, into our 9 to 5 day. We're saying, right, we want you to just come in and work, and that's it. We don't really want to know if, you know, during Eid you want to go and fast or pray 5 times a day. We're not really too fussed if it's, let's say, Diwali. You know, we don't get an Easter and a Christmas break. You know, for Diwali we don't get a day off, but it's in Indian culture, it's quite a big thing. And I think if we don't recognise that different people have different values, it always just forces them to come in, do their job, and actually you'll find that those people become quite stagnant and they find it quite hard to progress up, to make those connections, to actually feel involved within that practice and within that place of work. So I think it can be quite a lonely place if you don't really feel like you fit in. And then I also think from your development side, just having someone understand how hard it is to actually get to that next level up and get to that next position. So I'm recently qualified. Hopefully in a couple of years' time, when the time is right, I'd like to be able to just go in and say, right, I think I'm ready for this. In certain professions, certain practices, it would just be discounted. A lot of people would often look at my age and say, well, she's almost at an age where she's ready to have children, so that's a risk on us. And I think it's actually the individual shouldn't be changing their lifestyle. I shouldn't have to think as a female, when am I going to have children? When's the best time for me to have a child? If I want to be promoted by this date, I either need to have it before or I need to have a child after. It should actually be the industry saying, this is your career path. You tell us what you want to do and we'll work around your personal circumstances, and appreciate being out of the field for 9 months does stagnate somewhat of your development, but it shouldn't almost send you back to kind of the start of your career or progression ultimately.
It's really tricky trying to get companies to support women, and my experience has been that when you do study for a long time and you've invested a lot in your career development, there is no right answer about when you then have children or start a family, because it's like such a personal choice. And my experience is that you're in such a dilemma because you've done so much for your education, and then there's this fear that it all gets put on hold or even cancelled out because you start a family. So it's like, do I take that risk, or should I just, it's that, and there's no one to talk to about it.
No. And I think, and again, it goes back to that, the importance of having someone like you in the more senior positions and just having that understanding. So having female directors with children, with families who have had to go through that. And those are the people that can instill the change, really. And that's why representation is so important. Across whether it's engineering, construction, architecture, it is just so important to have the decision makers understand each of us as people rather than just employees, or just kind of numbers, or however it is you want to define it.
Yeah, or even being seen as an individual with a dilemma like this. I've always been astounded that, like, I felt like I'm the only person on the planet that's having to make these choices, when actually, if we are trying to go for gender equality, it's really something that needs to be absolutely addressed across the board. It's like, all women ask themselves the question whether they want to be mothers or not. Like, why is this, somehow a decision that we have to sort of conduct in private?
100%. And I think for me it was just, we have an associate director. She's female, she's Asian, she speaks very openly about mental health and well-being, and she's just a great asset. So she's not based in this studio, and she's returning to work. So but she's fantastic. She's a fantastic source. So actually, members of management, of the senior management, can actually look to her and draw in on her experience, and she's in that position. Whereas actually, I think it would be quite harrowing for me as myself in this studio, where my four managers are men, and as a male, you only take 2 weeks paternity, or typically you take 2 weeks paternity leave,
which is already a massive leap forward, because men had far less paternity leave previously.
Yeah. And again, it goes back to, we are improving, because with the changing role of men and women, and I know we should never ever put male and females into the stereotypes, but typically it was the man went to work and the female stayed at home and looked after the children, and then women started to go to work, but they still continued that housewife role, so they still continued to look after the children and the house. But actually now, kind of moving on to where we are, men look after the children, they do the school runs, and we are in a bit more of a fortunate position with having hands-on dads in the industry and in these roles, that they can recognise and acknowledge, you know, this is our life outside of work. We have commitments, and it's important that we consider, you know, if we have parents, they might have to take a sick day off for children. We've got to be flexible with pick up, drop off. But it all just goes back to that understanding different societies, different communities, different individuals, and just different needs. And it's really great at the moment. The practice is looking at, so they've put out a survey just purely to do that, to understand everyone's niche needs, on whether it's, do you care for an elderly member of your family, do you care for a child with special needs, and I think that's the element of professions that I feel have been missing. We work in such a corporate world, and I think it's probably the same for engineering and the wider construction field, but it's all been so corporate, and we've kept our personal lives quite separate. It's always been keep business and pleasure very, very separate, which is why we've never really spoken about, actually, I'm a female and I want to do this, or I'm a male and I'm doing this in the family role. And it's always been
I think COVID really brought it all together.
Yeah.
There was a complete blurring of lines which couldn't be avoided.
No.
It's stuck.
No. Yeah. And it really brought in the conversations of, right, I'm a dad, and, you know, I'm working from my home, and that's it. Whereas usually it's, right, I'm heading home, that's it. And I think it's just being quite open, and actually, as I think I said earlier, just acknowledging everyone in these professions as people with lives. You know, when we close the door to the office, we don't just go home to bed and that's it, and then just wake up the next morning to come into work. We do a lot more. We're probably a lot more interesting than actually we give ourselves credit for outside of work.
Yeah, I mean, we've touched upon it already, but you know, when you were talking about being of a sort of childbearing age, and your seniors kind of looking at your age thinking, oh gosh, she may want to start a family, that's extremely inconvenient and could be quite expensive for the company. Like, what are some practical, realistic changes that companies can make to not lose talent because of legitimate human kind of
just life?
Yeah. Like, having a family shouldn't be a crime. So how can companies embrace good talent, but at the same time accommodate people doing life stuff?
So I think the key thing for me was, and I've had conversation about short-term, mid-term, long-term progression and what it is I want in my career. And as part of those conversations, I've asked a question. So I think one, just being quite an open company and having that open door policy and just allowing those conversations to be quite normal and comfortable. I also, and then further to those conversations, I also had the assurance of we'll be quite flexible around you. And I think it's just understanding actually to retain that talent. We're not asking, for you to move heaven and earth, but actually, if we can work from home a couple of days, if we can, small things like let's just readjust working hours so we can now allow for pickup and drop offs. And it's just it's that sense of compassion and that empathy of just, I can't make it into work for 9 because I've got to do X, Y, and Z before. And I think that for me, that was quite reassuring that actually life might change slightly. Are you willing to support those changes? And they do it for a number of the mothers, kind of the new mothers here. And we've got working from home. We've got support, so keep in touch days as well. And I think that's the key thing. I think it's I've seen it with quite a few new mothers. So I'm at the age where all my friends have started to have children. And a number of them said, actually, I went on maternity, but I felt quite anxious about going back. I'd not spoken to anyone from work since having the baby, other than congratulations, how's baby? But actually keeping my toe in the job, in that water, it was just almost, it was 9 months, that was it, out the door, and then that was it, I'll come back in. But small things like keep in touch days, so we have once a week, as leading up to your kind of the end of your maternity, we'll often have new mothers come back into the practice, and they'll just work half a day, and they generally won't be resourced into a project, but they'll just get kind of thrown back into the swing of meetings and kind of the office. And
what's that like for the mothers?
I think it's quite nice for them. I think it's quite nice to actually see it's not going to be a huge thing going back to work. I did it before, I can do it again. It also reassures them that they're not going to be thrown in at the pace they probably were working at just before. They will be eased back into it, and there is that support available. And I think it's also just understanding and getting to know people in the practice again. I think, in the office, you get to know people really well because you see them every day. But outside of work, if you don't have those relationships, you can almost become strangers again. So it just reaffirms some of those relationships, and I think it just relinquishes those anxieties about that returning to work. And again, it's those small things that have retained the kind of the new mothers. Well, I think anyway, that have retained the new mothers and actually thought, I'm quite happy to continue here, or I was quite happy to make the decision to have a child whilst here.
So talent is one thing, and sort of vision and innovativeness is another thing. What would you say in architecture is really innovative at the moment? Like, where is the innovative thinking at this present time in architecture?
I think the key one at the moment is sustainability. So the construction industry produces and contributes to some of the largest portions of greenhouse gases and carbon emissions. So there is a huge pledge, and there is a huge pressure on architects and the construction industry to reduce that. So looking at different ways of building, different ways of constructing, whilst maintaining the level and the cost of construction, and the speed in which we can erect buildings. I think another key one is also accessible and diverse design. So understanding the neurodiversity. Been doing a kind of a lot of discussions around this at the moment, and understanding that we now have some of the highest levels of neurodiverse conditions, and actually more and more being recognised in younger people. So in schools, for example, having safe spaces, so it's not just SEN schools, it's within all schools. So understanding that in mainstream schools you have students with mild strands of autism, and it's providing safer spaces for those and comfortable spaces. Within flats and apartments, again, it's putting a bit more onus on, are they adaptable for people with disabilities, people with mild kind of deformities? Can they access and get around these spaces rather than just the bare minimum of building regulations? So we are starting to see a little bit more of the social side of it as well, and designing for the human rather than just designing a building. But yeah, the key one is sustainability at the moment.
And for you personally, why was architecture the right fit for you?
So it's kind of quite it's quite a fairy tale story, my journey into architecture. I got taken to Italy when I was 11, and I just started to. I borrowed, or my mum had one of those digital cameras, the one that you put the memory card in, and I went around and I started to take pictures of the columns and all the small details around these buildings. Didn't really think much of it, didn't really know much about architecture. To be honest, I probably didn't even really know what an architect was. And then upon returning, my mum bought me a book on architecture, and she said, have a read through this, I think you might like it. Had a read through, and I just fell in love with it, and I just really fell in love with understanding how things came together, how they were constructed. I was just in awe of the design and the really intricate designs of the Doric columns and the Corinthian columns, and I think just actually appreciating the craft that went into them. So I've always been quite a crafty person. So all of that culminated for me. I just thought, wow, this is, I love this job. And then as I got older and I started to understand the profession a little bit more, and then my education just became quite tailored to becoming an architect. So, doing maths, doing physics, and again, it just reaffirmed those passions, and those skills. And I started in practice, and actually, it was just a job for me, and it was just the shoe that fit, and it was just a really happy coincidence that I fell into the profession.
Yeah, I mean, something that always strikes me, I did engineering, my sister did architecture, and my other sister did veterinary science.
Mm-hmm.
And they're all professions that are at least 7 years at university. You work so hard and you pour so much passion into these kinds of professions. And at the end of it all, you're not massively financially remunerated, but it's so personally fulfilling to do these types of professions. And I find that so much more heartwarming, especially because, when I see a lot of my colleagues that did engineering, we all did engineering together, and many of them went into banking because there was so much money to be earned. But the engineers that stayed in engineering really, make such a difference to society, such an impact.
Yeah, and I think that's it. Whenever I speak to anyone about someone considering doing architecture, the first thing I say to them is, don't expect the big wage. And I said, you have to really have that drive to get you through it. It's not an easy, mean feat. It's not just something that's a tick box, and similar to mechanical engineering, you're never just going to arrive at that solution. there'll be many iterations, many kind of just starting the process again. In our instance, many presentations that maybe don't go as well, and just coming back to the drawing board. And actually, in those instances, it can be quite disheartening. But actually, it's that passion that you have, and it's that, right, I am going to find a solution. We are going to work this out. And we will get to the end of whatever project it is we're working on. So we will get this building built. And I think that's it. I think it's just that passion that can allow you to see that end goal, and look at that whole holistic experience rather than just looking at it as a day-to-day job. And the projects that you and I often work on, they're from a year to 2 years to 3 years, so it's quite a long haul. And I always say, architecture is a journey, it's not a destination. You have to be quite satisfied with the journey.
So what is your sort of plan for your journey, like 5 to 10 years sort of plan?
So I think definitely continue in architecture. So I'm currently building my own house, so I think get that finished.
Oh gosh, is that in the UK?
It's been going, yeah. So it's been going for 2 years. So just with COVID and kind of the impact of labour and materials. So yeah, number 1, get that finished. Number 2, I think just get some more experience and eventually start to work my way up within the practice. But then bringing in the social and the ethics side that I have quite an interest in. I'd quite like to use that role to make some of the changes that we discussed in practice. So actually, for the next Kavita that walks in post undergrad, I'd quite like to pave that way, and for her or him to feel, actually, it doesn't matter. It doesn't matter the colour of my skin, my race, my gender, anything. The architectural world is my oyster. And I think we all globally are obviously working towards a more sustainable world. I think, actually making a difference, making a change there, trying to contribute, and hopefully one day as well, I think privately, just try and get into a little bit more exploring, because it's, as you say, you study for so long, put your life on hold a little bit, and then you get thrown into profession. And I took a few leaps of faith, and I've taken a little bit of time out. But yeah, I think once now it's started to settle, get back into that and actually fall back in love with all the bits that I fell in love with architecture again.
Yeah, it's inspiring to hear the way you have articulated this idea of turning any obstacles you've faced into paving stones for other people to walk on. Kind of love that, because sometimes pioneers and trailblazers can get weighed down with trailblazing and pioneering, because it can be a lonely existence, and it's like, why am I pushing for this? And then you see younger generations kind of just waltzing through the path that you've laid down. But it is really rewarding to help other people help themselves. It's really rewarding, even though the struggle is real in doing that. But there were generations before us doing the same for us. So yeah, it's like paying it forward. You seem far too young to be talking about future generations, but at the same time, I think role models can be any age.
Yeah, 100%. I think it's going back to, I said, you can have, for myself, and probably similar to mechanical engineering, you can have kind of a technical role model, so someone that teaches you how to do your job, how to do it well, how to really define and refine that way of thinking. But then there is that social side, and the shaping you as a person and as a professional, and actually ethically and morally how you work, and whether that's you are just going to go on that journey and do whatever it is you're going to get to wherever you want to, or you're going to go on that journey and you'll go on it with everyone around you. And I think, it's really important to have those role models. And I think for me as well, it's just recognizing I could have complained, I could have left the profession, and I could have said, oh, I'm not happy with this and this, or we're really poor at this, but actually it's never going to change. My mum's a chartered accountant, and it was a lot worse for her entering the profession 40 years ago. But the best piece of advice she gave me was, I became the change I wanted to see. And she said, that's all you've got to do. And she said, you've just got to start the conversations. And she said, sometimes you'll often find it's just a lack of understanding. It's kind of a softer word for ignorance, but quite often our members of management, not maliciously, there's that kind of lack of inclusion just because there's that lack of understanding. Yeah. And she said it can quite often be resolved with just a conversation. And she said, if we run away from these conversations, we run away from people understanding. And I think that's all I'm trying to do, just start the conversations and actually just make it a more open place. And when I start to develop, a studio rather than just having a team, I want that studio to feel it is quite an open space and it is quite understanding. Yes, we are professions, but we're this web of people rather than just we're this practice.
Yeah. Well, I have to say that it's been so refreshing having a conversation with you, because maybe it's the fact that architecture is an industry that embraces both the technical and the creative side of what you do, because in talking with you there is that acceptance, that kind of assumption that what you do can be extremely technical, but it is also important, fundamental, to have those what we call softer skills in engineering. We don't have that in engineering. In engineering, usually you've got to be really technical and really sort of logical and mathematical, and it's very cold. And this idea of softer skills, I mean, I even hate that term because it almost feels like derogatory, but the softer skill side to engineering is not embraced at all. It's almost seen as a weakness to talk about. And in having a conversation with you, it's so refreshing because you just talk about both sides of the brain, left brain, right brain, as though it's obvious that's what you need to have in order to succeed. And we're severely missing that in engineering. So I agree with your mum, and I agree with you that we need to have conversations about it, because the minute we talk about it, it just normalizes it, makes it less accommodating.
And it also opens that conversation up for the next person. And actually it just, I think it can be quite isolating without the conversations. You often think, is it just me that's thinking this? Is it, whereas actually if you know that other people are discussing it and there are other people that feel the same way as you, it's okay to feel like that.
Yeah. Well,
So
thank you for giving us permission to talk about this freely, kind of without shame and embarrassment. I think it's extremely empowering to talk about the other side of the technical coin, which are these kind of slightly sort of mental healthy type of issues, and management, people management, and social interactivity, and all of that crucial stuff that actually makes industry more wholesome and impactful.
yeah, and ultimately, especially for architecture, we're so studio based and we work in such close proximity. It just makes us stronger as a team. It actually, we understand everyone's strengths, everyone's weaknesses. We can identify how best people work. We understand kind of the person behind the monitor, or the drawing board, and it just really benefits the outputs. So you can see that human side, or those softer skills that you were talking about, actually they're the really small bits that when you walk around the building, you think, oh wow, that's a really small thing, but it's a really clever piece that makes me feel comfortable or safe, or it's really well considered that when I use this building, it makes my journey easier or more comfortable. And you start to see that throughout the whole process, all the way through to the building.
Wow, architecture is an extremely lucky